For any negotiation to succeed, you need to understand who is sitting across the table. Across the table in Vienna today is the same regime, led in many cases by the same people, who took American hostages for 444 days. Across the table in Vienna today is the same regime that killed 241 American Marines at the Beirut barracks, that blew up 19 American Air Force personnel at Kohr Towers, that not so long ago tried to bring terror to American soil with the plot foiled, thankfully, to bomb a Washington restaurant and the Embassy of Israel. Across the table in Vienna today is a regime that just last month marked 35 years of Islamic rule with street marches featuring banners reading "Death to America" and even "Death to Sherman," Wendy Sherman, the lead U.S. negotiator. Across the table in Vienna today is a regime that even in the 3 months since the initial agreement has stepped up the pace of summary execution of their own people. 80 since the beginning of the year. A regime that, even as it sits down in Vienna, in an order coming directly from Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, commanded thousands of Hezbollah fighters to join the Assad forces in Syria, works to undermine Iraq, smuggles missiles into southern Lebanon, and finances Hamas and a Palestinian Islamic Jihad to carry out terror strikes from the Gaza Strip. A regime that just in January was caught shipping arms to extremists opposing the pro-American government of Bahrain. All part of a plan to sow instability across the entire Middle East, threatening America's national security interests. This is a regime that is now, for the first time, sending Iranian naval vessels off the Atlantic coast of the United States, that test-fired 2 new long-range ballistic missiles. A regime that broadcast on Iranian television a simulation showing Iranian missiles destroying the USS Abraham Lincoln, bombs raining down on Israeli cities, and in an image too unmistakable to miss, Iranian missiles striking the Tel Aviv Azrieli skyscrapers, sending their twin towers crashing down. Broadcast in Iran with subtitles in Hebrew. Across the table in Vienna today is a regime that on the eve of the talks announced a generation of newer, faster centrifuges, whose president sat for a CNN interview and when asked whether Iran will agree to the destruction of centrifuges, replied, "Not under any circumstances." And in case his audience wasn't listening, he repeated the phrase, "Not under any circumstances." Across the table in Vienna today sit the representatives of a radical, revolutionary regime, ideological, unyielding, unapologetic to its very core. At least, at this moment, there is one thing Iran is not. From everything we know, Iran is not armed with nuclear weapons. And it must be kept that way. As I speak with you this morning, there are 3 points I need to add for context. First, we in this room, we're not the negotiators, even though we have a stake, a huge stake in the outcome. Second, we want to see negotiations succeed. How often do we hear, well, if the talks fail, then we'll move to additional consequences? But failure is not foreordained. We want to focus on success, not failure. And third, in the quest to stop Iran's nuclear program, these talks may be our last best chance to reach that goal peacefully. It all begins with a strong understanding of what's at stake. Each year for nearly 20 years now, as we meet in Washington, we shine a light on Iran, on its efforts, and on what we must do to stop it. Each year, we refine the tools we've helped build to slow Iran's progress towards a nuclear bomb. And unlike India or Pakistan, where the path to nuclear power was quiet and clandestine, and the nuclear breakout was a sudden shock, with Iran, we have been and must continue sounding the alarm. As President Obama's former senior arms control advisor, Gary Seymour, observes, I'm absolutely convinced Iran would have the bomb now if we hadn't exposed them and threatened them over the last decade. But as Seymour continues, at the same time, they've moved the program forward. And they're at the stage now where they have the basic technological competence to produce nuclear weapons. So what will it take to get them to stop? The answer to that question begins with our understanding of the centrality of the nuclear project to the regime in Tehran. Iran's leaders believe that a nuclear weapon is the guarantor of their regime's survival. And staying in power is something they care more about than anything else. It's for this reason Iran has spent billions and billions of dollars pursuing nuclear weapons, regardless of the impact on their economy or on their own people. They have endured punishing sanctions, isolation, and ostracism from the community of nations, and yet they persevere in their quest for the bomb. Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons is a matter of vital pride and its own perception of its security. It's hard to imagine any combination of incentives alone that is more valuable than their nuclear program. Abandoning that effort, dismantling their program so that there is no pathway forward to nuclear weapons capability, is not something the mullahs in Tehran will choose to do. History tells us that governments do not relinquish what is precious to them willingly. This doesn't mean a deal can't be done. It means that only pressure will compel it. Governments, like people, don't easily embrace change. They're made to change because change is the only course of action. The Obama administration, with congressional support, has led efforts to put together an international coalition to impose tough sanctions on this regime. Faced with crumbling economy that has alienated the Iranian people, the Iranians have come to the negotiating table. We welcome these negotiations as a test of the proposition of whether the Iranians are serious, whether they understand that there can be no respite from sanctions and isolation without the abandonment of their nuclear program. We support continued pressure on the Iranian regime during these negotiations because we strongly believe that the negotiations with the threat of assured consequences is the surest way, the only way to diplomatic success. In other words, if you're for diplomacy, if you're for peace, you should also be strongly for pressure. Pressure is a far better means to drive to a better solution, far better than to divine the sincerity of Iran's leaders and impute to them motivations that frankly tell us more about our hopes than their core beliefs. For 20 years, we have encouraged a consistent three-pronged strategy: sanctions, diplomacy, and the credible threat of force. Increasingly crippling sanctions to ensure that Iran would pay a heavy economic price for its nuclear ambition. Diplomacy as a means of persuading them to abandon their quest for nuclear capability with verifiable measures that can be monitored to provide confidence that its agreements will be kept. And finally, the credible threat of force, kept on the table. As President Obama says, all options open. Should Iran persist despite sanctions, despite the opportunity of negotiations on the path towards nuclear weapons? In the media today, and among members of the foreign policy elite, there is much discussion of Iran's division into moderates and hardliners, moderates ready to trade away Iran's nuclear program, and those hardliners who oppose them. From there, it's a short step towards a dangerous impulse that the West should somehow empower Iran's moderates and understand how difficult it is for them to outmaneuver the hardline faction. This division of Iran's ruling regime into moderates and hardliners, this is a great myth. Wendy Sherman, our chief negotiator, is right when she says the supreme leader is the only one who really holds the nuclear file. She adds, and I quote her, "No one should misunderstand or believe that President Rouhani is not anything but a very conservative cleric. He is about preserving the regime, not changing it." End of her quote. Moreover, Rouhani, not as president, but as the former lead negotiator, boasted of deceiving the West and using time bought through talks to secretly move the Iran's nuclear program forward. All of this demonstrates that this regime makes no secret of its clear devotion to the revolution and its nuclear ambitions. Therefore, we should understand that it was pressure that brought Iran to the table. And only increasing pressure can bring about a good deal. So the question becomes how? How do we sustain and build pressure on Iran to step back from its nuclear path, knowing that it doesn't want to? First, we have to continue to persuade decision makers in Washington that increasing pressure will neither drive the Iranians from the negotiations nor damage the international sanctions coalition. It's quite clear that the Iranians are at the table because they have to be, not because they want to be. And our coalition partners, they're sustaining the sanctions because the United States has made it clear to them they have a choice. Do business with Iran or do business with the United States. We believe that the risk of pressure damaging the coalition or driving the Iranians from the table is actually low. But the consequence of not increasing the pressure could be destructive to the success of negotiations. So how do we increase the pressure? Congressional engagement is key. We need Congress to keep the pressure on, to keep this issue in the public eye. Let's be clear about our expectations. Congress cannot negotiate, but it can set clear boundaries and the basic elements of a sound agreement, and serve as guarantors of a sound outcome. That is the rightful role of the U.S. Congress, a role we must encourage our legislative leaders to play today. Listen to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat Senator Bob Menendez, speaking on the Senate floor. Yes. And I quote the senator, "Let's remember that while we in the Senate are not at the negotiating table, we have a tremendous stake in the outcome and an obligation as a separate, co-equal branch of government representing the American people to provide oversight and an expression of what we expect as to what the end result should be. At the end of the day, we have an obligation to speak our minds in what we believe is the best interest of this nation." But this is more than a matter of constitutional powers, a dry lesson in the mechanics of the co-equal branches of the American government. This is a matter of ensuring that the voice of the American people is heard. Our negotiators are not operating in a vacuum. They negotiate on our behalf in service to the American people. And we, the people, are urging our elected members of Congress, the men and women we send to Washington to represent us, to serve as our public voice on an issue so central to the future of America and the world. Because as we see in opinion poll after opinion poll, the American people have made up their minds. Huge majorities do not trust Iran. They support more sanctions. They want negotiations and want Congress to have a role. The American people are right. We must keep Iran at the forefront of the public debate. We've got to make the case consistently and clearly that if you care about nuclear proliferation, if you care about human rights, if you care about a stable Middle East, you need to stand with us. We've got to make the case that continued pressure on Iran is essential if you want the talks to succeed, if you want Iran to surrender its nuclear weapons program, and if you recognize that this may be our last best chance to reach that goal without conflict, then you need to stand with us. We must count on Congress to make clear the basic elements of any sound agreement. And on this, there can be no compromise. The policy must be one of prevention. A sound agreement must include the dismantling of its nuclear program so extensive that Iran has neither a uranium nor a plutonium pathway to a nuclear weapon. And that is why on Tuesday, we together will be asking members of Congress to sign on to a letter that forcefully carries this message to the President. Second, both the House and the Senate should exercise oversight to ensure that our existing core sanctions architecture remain in place for the full duration of the negotiation. That Iran understands that the only way to end sanctions related to their nuclear program is to dismantle its nuclear programs demonstrably, verifiably, and irreversibly. Third, Congress must oversee the continual implementation of the interim agreement. And no trust is possible without the means to monitor the agreement and verify with certainty that its constraints are being kept. And finally, Congress must make clear what will happen if Iran cheats on the interim agreement or stonewalls, in the hope that the international community will cave in and collapse. For that reason, we support the Nuclear Weapon-Free Iran Act, sponsored by Senator Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, Senator Mark Kirk, Republican of Illinois, and 57 other Democrats and Republicans. This bill would present Iran with a menu of consequences, including new sanctions if the talks fail. Let me be very clear about the reality we now face and the task ahead of us. Far too many have succumbed to the Iranian charm offensive. Far too many have at least temporarily forgotten the true nature of the regime and how it has used past negotiations to provide cover for its nuclear program. And as a consequence, they've been led to believe that there should be less pressure on the Iranians during the course of negotiations. Our focus, first and foremost, is Congress, where we must continue to encourage legislators to increase the pressure. This will require perseverance. This task will not be achieved with one resolution, one letter, or a single piece of legislation. To make this case decisively, effectively, will require an extensive campaign, not just these next 3 days in Washington, but over weeks and months. We must encourage more congressional activity and public education that will involve all of us across the country. This is precisely the time for our voices to be heard. For all of us in AIPAC to deliver our message, to make it clear that America, Israel, and the world cannot accept any agreement that allows Tehran a nuclear weapons capability. So on Tuesday, be ready. On the Hill, you may meet some headwinds. You may hear, it's time to stand down. Now's not the time for this conversation. You may hear, ignore the statements of Iran's leaders. It's just so much rhetoric to placate their domestic hardliners. You may hear, let the P5 do their work. And if they fail, then count on me for tougher action. You may hear applying pressure will increase the probability of conflict. You may hear the sanctions coalition is too fragile to sustain the pressure while Iran is at the table. If we push too hard, the coalition will fall apart. You may hear all of these claims because your representatives may not have heard our arguments. Don't assume they understand our perspective. And don't underestimate the value of your voice on this issue. Because the fact is, the argument is right about the nature of the Iranian regime, about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, about Iran's willingness to dissemble and deceive to advance their nuclear agenda. Our argument is persuasive that only through continued pressure can we successfully negotiate an end to Iran's nuclear quest peacefully. We need to make our case now because we need to stop Iran now. When you're up on the Hill, no matter what reception you receive, no matter how forcefully your member of Congress may express reservations, be gracious and be respectful. And then make clear that the conversation cannot end here, that you will come back to press the case that strong pressure is the only way to keep Iran at the table, the only way to deliver an agreement that ends the nightmare of a nuclear Iran and open a path for peace and stability. This is our message. This is our mission. Thank you.